In and around the lake, mountains come out of the sky, and you shoot them, as Segaiden enters 1987.
I'm too old for this.
After their big holiday rush for December 1986, Sega decided to give gamers and their wallets a breather by taking a few months off. When the company resumed releases in March of 1987, it gave us an experience the NES wouldn't match for another year and a half. For those of you conspiracy-minded types who feel that Sega never properly receives the credit it deserves for its groundbreaking works, I have to assume that Great Baseball sits at the center of your string board. I mean, look at this thing. Sega created, to my knowledge, the very first realistic baseball game for consoles seen in the post-Famicom era. It directly duplicates the look and cadences of Accolade's 1985 computer hit Hardball, a series that wouldn't make its way to consoles until the Sega Genesis release in 1991. And you know what other series lifted Hardball's style? That's right, Jaleco's Bases Loaded. And you know when Bases Loaded debuted? Autumn 1988 in the US, and way back in June 1987 in Japan. Meanwhile, Great Baseball shipped in the US 3 months before the Japanese debut of Bases Loaded, March 1987. 18 months before Bases Loaded made its way here. Sega then backported it to Japan's Mark III in August under the name The Pennant, which means it showed up in Japanese shops a couple of months after Bases Loaded debuted on Famicom as Moero Pro Yaku. Jaleco may have beaten Sega to the punch in that territory, but was The Pennant a comically busted piece of software whose glitches and exploits have given that game a permanent reputation as worthless trash? As it turns out, no. Great Baseball offers a fully competent take on the sport, with solid play mechanics and attractive graphics that eschew the Nintendo baseball famista look that dominated the genre on Japanese consoles at the time in favor of realistically proportioned humans, even in the fielding view. Great Baseball alternates between 2 points of view: the bird's eye fielding perspective, which automatically toggles between the entire field, or infield only, depending on the ball's location, and the broadcast-style pitching perspective. Players bat and pitch via the latter viewpoint. When a batter manages to connect with the ball, the camera mode automatically shifts to the zoomed-out overhead perspective. Now, Great Baseball is still an 8-bit baseball game, which means it suffers from the usual quirks of the era. The computer-controlled opponents feel terribly unbalanced, especially when it comes to the outfield. AI fielders have the ability to place themselves exactly at the point where a fly ball will land. But the fielders you control have no such ability and end up scrambling at a glacial pace to track down a missed pop-up, while the computer's runners snag base after base. I mean, really, Great Baseball plays like someone played face-off with Hardball and Famista, grafting the former's face onto the latter's skull. Even so, it represents a remarkable leap forward for Sega, skipping right from 80K's primitive champion baseball to the Hardball style, and giving American Master System owners in particular some real bragging rights over their Nintendo-playing classmates. As big as Major League Baseball was in the US back in the 80s, you'd think Great Baseball would be a bigger deal. Yet I can honestly say that I've never heard anyone even mention the thing. A fairly significant Sega creation that absolutely vanished into anonymity while 80s kids wax rhapsodic about Bases Loaded. Well, at least our second game this episode has something of a legacy, even if that mostly has to do with its arcade version. But, as with Great Baseball, Space Harrier sees the Master System and Sega attempting to do things that the NES wouldn't try to match until much later. With Space Harrier, we have Master System's second conversion of a superscalar game, this time with somewhat mixed results. This cartridge definitely resembles its coin-op counterpart, but it pushes the console a little too hard to be as convincing a port as Hang-On. I feel like Space Harrier needs no real introduction to anyone who knows anything about arcade gaming. So this next bit is for you poor kids who missed out on the heady days of 25-cent bliss in a room full of dazzling pixels and engrossing chiptunes. Debuting a few months after Hang-On in arcades, on the same hardware, Space Harrier began life as a game about a fighter plane, a spiritual follow-up to Zaxxon, or more directly, Future Spy, before turning into something much weirder. According to Yu Suzuki in an unsourced interview translated by Schmublations, the original superscalar board lacked the power to properly depict a convincing jet. That would come later with AFTERBURNER. But in 1985, the Space Harrier team settled on controlling a guy instead of a plane, at which point any hope of realism went right out the window. So instead of setting the game in the real world against terrestrial adversaries, Suzuki's team went for the surreal, correctly identifying progressive rock as the aesthetic and creative apex of humanity to that point. Space Harrier adopted a visual style influenced by British artist Roger Dean, best known for his album covers for prog rock bands like Yes, Badger, and Uriah Heep. Soon after, Dean would actually begin to create cover artwork for actual games, gracing wretched crap for UK publisher Psygnosis like Barbarian and Shadow of the Beast with evocative fantasyscapes that greatly outclassed the material within. Though he would later forge a relationship with Hank Rogers that resulted in some stylish boxes for sequels to Tetris and the Black Onyx. Anyway, much like James Cameron would do 20 years later, Suzuki's team cribbed Dean's style. The floating rock formations, the flat landscapes stretching into alien backdrops, the unconventional color palettes that border on fauvism. Space Harrier is a game about a guy who flies around the sky on his own power, somehow. Yet despite this amazing ability, he lacks any other real talents. He doesn't have super invulnerability, dying with a scream at the slightest touch of an obstacle or enemy. And he doesn't have any innate offensive capabilities, instead lugging around a massive laser cannon tube that he uses to fire into the distance. Fundamentally, Space Harrier represented the next step in Sega's 3D experimentation and evolution, using Hang-On's tech to improve on the gameplay concepts seen in VCO object boards like Subrock 3D and Zoom 909. Although you follow behind a guy instead of a spaceship, the core action works about the same as in those older games. Your on-screen avatar zips forward, firing beams into the distance in order to destroy incoming enemies that grow larger in size as they approach the point-of-view camera. As you maneuver, you need to take care not to collide with obstacles, which also grow in scale as the player character approaches their position in space. As with the VCO object system, the Superscalar board accomplished all of this by displaying bitmap sprites whose size on the screen could be altered at a hardware level in order to create the timely illusion of relative distance in space, and turn the screen into a window on a world that appeared larger on the inside of the cabinet. However, the Superscalar hardware offered a bigger, faster, and bolder experience. And Space Harrier showcases that in a way that Hang-On's grounded terrestrial racing couldn't. And the Master System does an admirable job of simulating it, despite once again running on hardware equivalent to an arcade board a generation older than the Superscalar spec. Slipping free of the bonds of gravity, our friend the Harrier can zoom around the screen in all directions. This being an on-rail shooter, you don't need to worry about steering within the bounds of Hang-On's racetrack, instead moving at will to every corner of the screen in order to take aim at oncoming targets and avoid incoming hazards. Those hazards include sceneries like trees, and Roger Dean-esque rock formations, enemies themselves, and the projectiles they fire. Everything appears in the distance as a tiny object that quickly rushes forward while expanding wildly in size. The exaggerated surrealistic sensory overload that Space Harrier creates with its visuals doesn't just heighten its distinct sense of style, it also enhances the gameplay. The game throws a preposterous amount of stuff at players in an attempt to overwhelm the senses, but at the same time it also does a great job of highlighting the critical details that players need to watch for. That includes projectiles, which you trade back and forth with enemies as volleys of neon-tinged, pill-shaped laser bursts. Your bullets trail off into space, giving you a clear sense of how you need to move around to adjust your aim to take out your targets. Conversely, enemy projectiles grow almost comically large in size as they approach the screen. Although the chaos of the action can sometimes obscure threats until it's too late, enemy projectiles scale up to become enormous through several stages of visual transition, which makes them easier to keep tabs on and avoid. Obviously, the Master System can't handle everything the arcade machine threw around, though the programmers responsible for this conversion did their damnedest. Space Harrier on Master System renders a surprising number of objects on screen at any given time, and you never see the kind of sprite flicker or slowdown that an NES game would have suffered for attempting such a muscular graphical demonstration. Given the hardware limitations, you have to forgive the jerky scaling of objects as you approach them. The Master System lacks the Superscalar board's ability to change the display size of a sprite on a per-frame basis, which means that this version of Space Harrier uses the old-fashioned approach of rendering objects with different sprites according to their position in space relative to the player. That is, they scale up in steps rather than smoothly. Actually, the greatest visual sin Space Harrier commits on Master System is the way it breaks its illusion of space by clipping out sprite details when objects overlap. A shortcoming that I think means that the only actual sprites you see here are the player's avatar, bullets, and explosions, the only elements that don't clip out other objects in the distance when they overlap. The on-screen objects in this game shockingly don't appear smaller on screen than their arcade counterparts, with the Harrier himself occupying a remarkable chunk of visual real estate. No 8-bit console could possibly push this many huge bitmap sprites. And it seems Space Harrier doesn't try to make that demand upon the Master System. Instead, I posit that everything but the player and his projectiles appears here as a background tile, dynamic scenery that players can seemingly interact with. American console gamers hadn't really seen anyone use this trick this early on in 1987. Plenty of games would use this concept to render massive monsters. See the Yellow Devil and Mecha Dragon and Mega Man games, among others. But I can't think of a single instance of a game incorporating interactive elements through background tiles to this degree before Space Harrier on Master System. This approach has a few obvious downsides, most notably the fact that background tiles can't overlap with one another on this hardware. While the Master System's sprites can include a transparent color value that allows sprites to stack one on top of the other, background tiles exist as boxes. And the corners of any element that the game presents as appearing closer than another clip through the elements behind it. It's an understandable compromise, a necessary evil to pull off something this impressive on 8-bit hardware. But given the sheer number of objects that appear to be flying around the screen at any given moment, this limitation does sometimes render the action utterly incomprehensible. When the hardware attempts to create the sensation of dozens of arcade sprites stacked on top of one another with background tiles, such as when you face off against bosses, the corner clipping causes tons of crucial details to simply vanish. Consider the first boss, a dragon that consisted of a string of overlapping body segment sprites fronted by either a face or a tail sprite and capable of spewing bursts of flame. The Master System does its best to equal the arcade presentation, but it just can't fully recreate the look of the dragon, and it degenerates into a sort of visual incoherence almost immediately. This is not simply a complaint about some sort of technical hitch. The fact that most of the crucial visual information involved in this battle simply doesn't render on screen means that surviving such encounters ultimately amounts to you, the player, predicting what the game will do and acting preemptively, because reacting to what you see on screen is practically impossible. On top of that, objects lack the more varied animation of their arcade counterparts, since the need to store multiple graphical images to simulate scaling trumps niceties like movement. As a result, everything you see here has more of a cardboard cutout look than its arcade equivalent, as if the targets in Marksman shooting had suddenly morphed into monocloptic pachyderms, or legally fraught Rick Dom and TIE Fighter knockoffs. Still, despite the cutbacks and compromises, Space Harrier on Master System stands out as one hell of an impressive effort to bring a cutting-edge arcade experience to a console that retailed for $150. The closest that competing consoles could come to offering anything comparable before the 1989 arrival of Genesis and TurboGrafx-16 are the various Atari ports of Ball Blazer, which appeared in 1986, and the 3D Adventures of World Runner for NES, which shipped later in 1987. Don't even ask about the bleak Spartan NES port of Space Harrier that Tengen put out in 1989. Even the most impressive of the competition's brazen Space Harrier clone games lacked the unique combination of speed, freedom of motion, all-range combat, and graphical detail that Sega invested into this home port. Which isn't to say that Sega put this one out and decided to rest on its collective laurels. 1988 would bring us Space Harrier 3D, a sequel whose support for active shutter 3D glasses feels like a direct attempt to humble Square and Pony Canyon for having the audacity to rip off Sega's hit. Even if it doesn't always quite achieve its ambitious objectives, Space Harrier for Master System aims so high and shoots with such impressive accuracy that, at the time of its US release in early 1987, it easily stands as the single crowning technical achievement of console games to this point. Sega absolutely demolished everything that had come before. Sure, it's not a perfect match for the arcade game, but who could have expected a console to achieve cutting-edge coin-op perfection? Space Harrier for Master System eclipses any home version to appear on other consoles and computers available in 1987. While it couldn't recreate Yu Suzuki's technical superscalar landmarks without some compromises, the solutions and results on display here handily demonstrate that Sega had more brilliant programmers than just Suzuki on staff. Well, at least one anyway. Yeah, Space Harrier was the work of that Yuji Naka guy. Also of note, or at least a footnote, is that Space Harrier arrived in the US at the same time that the final SG-1000 release hit Japanese retail with the Black ONYX. Granted, I would wager that not a single American child who snagged a copy of Space Harrier's gridded box at their local Montgomery Ward that month had the first clue that Sega even had an entire other console for sale over in Japan. So this detail doesn't really have much relevance to anything. But it does seem fitting that as Sega closed the book on their first generation of hardware once and for all, this incredible showcase for their future aspirations arrived in the States, which would become a stronghold of Sega fandom once the next generation of hardware after Master System rolled around. Next time on Segaiden, music terminology suffers a crippling semantic blow as Sega breaks down the barriers of meaning between quartet and duet.